We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this.
Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care.
Welcome back to episode 3 of the Sensible Socialist podcast. Today we're going to start where a lot of people do or should start, the Communist Manifesto. Why? Because it's a short text and it does a fantastic job of laying out a sort of communist perspective. It is a little old. It's from, back in the 19th century, but it does lay a great groundwork for understanding both Marxist thought and just sort of different kinds of communist ideas that were around at the time and that have still persisted. So it goes through like how generally we on the left see the rise of capitalism, the problems with it, and what solutions that we have to bring. So if you haven't already, pop over to the supplemental episode where I've just straight up read the manifesto, so you don't have to. So did you listen? Good. The Communist Manifesto, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, was published in London by a group of German-born revolutionary socialists known as the Communist League in February 21st, 1848. The year of the publication is not an accident. At the time, partially motivated by a potato famine and by the political repression and economic woe, revolution was fomenting all around Europe, and France had lit the spark that would ignite the whole continent in revolution. So what are the origins of the manifesto? Why write it? Why Marx and Engels? Why then? What was it supposed to do? Origins of the manifesto. It's hard to separate the manifesto from the man holding the pen, or the men holding the pen. Karl Marx was born in Trier, Prussia, in 1818, son of a Jewish lawyer who converted to Lutheranism. He studied law and philosophy at universities of Berlin and Jena, and initially was a follower of Hegel, the 19th century philosopher I discussed in the definitions episode. In 1842, Marx became the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal democratic newspaper in Cologne. The newspaper grew considerably under his guidance, but in 1843, the Prussian authorities shut it down for being too outspoken. That year, Marx moved to Paris to co-edit a new political review. Paris at the time was the center of socialist thought, and Marx adopted a more extreme form of socialism that he called communism, which called for a revolution by the working class that would tear down the capitalist world. In Paris, Marx befriended Engels, a fellow Prussian who had lived for a while in England, but also shared his views and would become a lifelong collaborator. In 1845, Marx was expelled from France and settled in Brussels, and he, at that point, renounced his Prussian nationality and was eventually joined by Engels. The communist current in the French Revolution was represented by Gracious Babeuf and Darte. After their execution on May 27th, 1797, communism disappeared and was apparently forgotten. Babeuf was a very early sort of proponent of communism way back in the French Revolution, the first French Revolution, and so was a very influential person, both because everybody knew about the French Revolution and all people used it as a sort of launching point for talking about their particular political beliefs. So by 1828, French Democrats and radicals, incensed by the revolutionary pressures of the Bourbon Restoration, began secretly organizing, and after the July Revolution in 1830, which ousted the Bourbons, they united with the proletarian elements, mainly for preparing a broad republican movement, wanted to create a new republic in France. Gradually, the proletarian elements got the upper hand, and the communist theories, dormant for about 30 years because of repression, began to resurge and sort of propagated across France. The leaders of these communist elements were Armand Barbet and Louis-Auguste Blanqui. They succeeded from older Republican organizations and formed the Société des Familles, and in 1835 the Société des Saisons, which in May 1839 attempted an insurrection, but were defeated. Connected with the same societies and movements were the German refugees in Paris, who in 1834 founded in Paris the, quote, League of the Banished, among whom the proletarian communist elements were sort of pontificating. The League of the Banished was transformed in 1836 into the League of the Just, which, through the journeyman tailor Weitling, was partly inculcated with the ideas of cooperative production. The League was connected with the Société des Saisons and indirectly with the left wing of the Chartist movement in England. Thus, a sort of nucleus of a proletarian communist international was created in the 1830s in Paris. The role of Engels, I think it's important to stop here and note that Engels is often discussed as a sort of collaborator in the manifesto and with Marx. But really, much of the manifesto, especially the first section, is borrowed heavily from a catechism of 25 questions and answers written by Engels in October of 1847, just a year before the manifesto would actually come out. It was called The Principles of Communism. Marx's discussion of the process of industrialization, the development of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the causes and consequences of the sort of business cycle in the manifesto is basically taken from the answers 4, 11, 12, and 13 of Engels' Principles. The discussion of these issues contained in the Principles was a summary of material from Engels' 1845 book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England. David McClellan, Marx's biographer, maintains that Engels' book provided an empirical basis for several of Marx's later theories. It was a foundational document of what was to become Marxian socialist tradition. It's therefore useful to briefly summarize the analysis of capitalist development that Engels put forward. So according to Engels, the introduction of machinery and the division of labor that occurred as a result of the Industrial Revolution greatly increased productivity, but, quote, every improvement in machinery throws workers out of employment, and the greater the advance, the more numerous the unemployed. That is exactly what we're talking about nowadays with AI and the sort of technological revolution. The class of workers, quote, most ill-used by the introduction of machinery was the hand-loom cotton weavers, thousands of whom had become poverty-stricken as a result of the adoption of the power loom. The increased use of machinery also enabled the bourgeoisie to replace adult male workers with women and by children, who were able to be employed at way lower wages. As a result, quote, wages in general have been reduced to the improvement of machinery, unquote. The centralizing tendency of competition, Engels said, brought about the rise of business cycles. But every 5 years or so, a crisis would occur. During each crisis, many small manufacturers failed, and while the large manufacturers closed their mills or went to short time, despite the sharp increases in charity and poor relief expenditures in result of increasing unemployment, quote, want becomes universal among the workers. Engels knew all of this firsthand. As the son of a successful textile manufacturer, in 1842, Engels was sent by his father to Westday in Manchester to work in the offices of Ehrman and Engels, their mill, the Victoria Mill. So his father hoped that doing some work would kind of push him away from his obviously radical beliefs. Didn't exactly go over as his father intended. All right, back to the business cycle. So during these downturns, after a year or two of a sort of depression, prosperity usually returns and the demand for labor increases. As a result of the sharp fluctuations in labor demand, Engels explains that, quote, English manufacture must have at all times, save the brief periods of highest prosperity, an unemployed reserve army of workers in order to be able to produce the masses of goods required by the market in the liveliest of months. When they were not employed in the factories, the members of the reserve army live by huckstering, peddling, performing occasional odd jobs, begging, or stealing. What we would basically call either the precariat, or the that's what we would call the precariat, or even the lumpenproletariat. The development of capitalism led to the creation of these great manufacturing towns to which numbers of agricultural laborers, Irishmen, a number of different people migrated in search of employment. The living conditions in these cities were horrible. The working class was crowded into slums in which the housing was poor, bad ventilation, bad state of repair, didn't have very good sewage, anything like that. I mean, most of them didn't even have any kind of adequate water supply and completely lacked drainage facilities. It's no surprise that death rates were extremely high in the industrial cities. The working conditions in the cotton factories in particular, the long hours standing at work in damp, warm, and badly ventilated rooms, were greatly injurious to the health of the workers, especially women and children, who were by and large being employed at greater and greater rates in order to keep the wages down. The, quote, hateful greed of the manufacturers resulted in women unfit for childbearing, children deformed, men enfeebled, limbs crushed, whole generations wrecked, afflicted with disease and infirmity. Engels maintained that because the bourgeoisie did nothing to ameliorate the living and working conditions of the working class, it was guilty of social murder. The bourgeoisie achieved political dominance with the passage of the Reform Act in 1832, which enfranchised middle-class property holders and increased the representation of the industrial districts in Parliament. Engels declared the bourgeoisie as a class to be, quote, incurably debased by selfishness. To him and to Marx, the adoption of the new Poor Law in 1834, which forced able-bodied paupers and their families into workhouses, was an open declaration of war against the proletariat. The revolt of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie began early in the Industrial Revolution, and by 1844 had passed through several stages, from crime to machine breaking and arson to trade unionism. Unions represented the first attempt of the workers to abolish competition, said Engels. They greatly nourished the workers' hatred of the bourgeoisie, and the bourgeoisie in turn constantly tried to destroy the unions. Unionism was especially powerful in those branches of industry in which the factory system predominated. Thus, Lancashire, especially Manchester, is the seat of the most powerful unions, Engels said. Lancashire was also the center of Chartism. Chartism was the working class movement for political reform, which began in the spring of 1838 with the publication of the People's Charter, a petition to Parliament demanding, among other things, universal manhood suffrage, equal electoral constituencies, the payment of members of Parliament, the abolition of the requirement that members of Parliament be property owners, and hence the People's Charter, Chartism. Engels maintained that the Chartist demands were, quote, sufficient to overthrow the whole English constitution. The spread of Chartism was greatly accelerated by the new Poor Law, which intensified the proletariat's hate for the property holders. At the conclusion of the book, Engels predicts that the next crisis in 1846 or 1847 would lead to the adoption of the Chartist proposals, and that the following crisis in 1852 or 1853 would lead to a revolution of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. That didn't happen. I think it's fair to say that if Engels had lived not, say, in Manchester, but in Birmingham, his conception of class and his theories in the role of class history might have been different. In this case, Marx might have been not necessarily a communist, but maybe a currency reformer. Similarly, McClellan, the biographer, wrote that if Engels had spent more time in London, where manufacture was still dominated by artisans, and he would have got a different picture of the development of capitalism. Engels himself noted many years later the importance of his time in Manchester between 1842 and 1844 for his intellectual development, saying, quote, in Manchester was forcibly brought to my notice that economic factors, hitherto ignored or at least underestimated by historians, play a decisive role in the development of the modern world. I learned that economic factors were the basic cause of the clash between different classes in society, and I realized that in a highly industrialized country like England, the clash of social classes lay at the very root of the rivalry between parties and was of fundamental significance in tracing the course of modern history. In sum, the economic and historical analysis contained in the Communist Manifesto largely is derived from Engels' description of the development of cotton textile industry in South Lancashire and in the first half of the 19th century, and of social and political conditions in Manchester in the 1840s. And while not mirrored elsewhere, Engels' critiques are still relevant to those struggling in that period of time and this one, and all across the world. When the potato famine hit, it led to a huge uptick in the price of food, and many went hungry. So at that time, there were just bread riots, people rioting just to get bread. And so that decade started to be called the Hungry 40s. So in America, where we escaped the worst of the blight, our connection to the potato famine is basically with Irish immigration. Indeed, the famine hit worst in Ireland, where between 1846 and 1850, it lost nearly 4% of its population every year. To learn about all of this, I really highly recommend Mike Duncan's Revolution podcast, and I'll put a link to that in the description so that you can check that out. It's an amazing podcast, and if you want to find out more about the Hungry 40s, the revolution in France of 1830, or the 1848 revolution, Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast is the place to go. So meanwhile, elsewhere in Europe during this time, the most radical forces were creating a new movement that they called communism. They dreamed of sharing society's wealth and abolishing class distinctions. This early communism was a mix of brilliant insights, impractical utopian wishes, and daring deeds. Some early communists thought communal movements could greatly educate humanity in new ways without some kind of violent overthrow of the old order, as had happened previously. Others thought that small conspiracies could change society without deep roots among the masses of people. At the end of 1843, Marx had settled in Paris, and in between 1844 and 1845, he worked on his materialist conception of history, on the significance of the social classes and their opposing interests, and finally on the application of Ricardian economics to the proletarian movement. Ricardo was an economist which had basically been one of the developers with Adam Smith of what we would call modern economics or political economy. Marx came in contact with Proudhon and the Parisian and German working men in Paris. He soon realized that his greatest barrier to these works was Proudhon and his anarchistic critiques of property itself. Marx knew that to get anywhere he had to contend with and beat Proudhon, Weitling, and all that utopianism. He wrote an anti-Proudhon work called The Misery of Philosophy, because Proudhon's book was called The Philosophy of Misery. Poor Weitling got schooled by Marx in a debate and basically left. Everywhere he could, Marx aimed to sniff out mere petty bourgeois reformism, undefined and nebulous notions of socialism, and journeyman schemes of emancipating humanity, whatever that meant. To get a good, quick sort of overview of this, I really highly recommend The Young Marx, a new movie that has just come out and is ironically available on Amazon. But check that out. You can see Marx in these situations, actually talking to Proudhon and Weitling, and it's a very good movie. So check out The Young Marx. The members of the League soon reported the activity of Marx to the headquarters in London, where Marx's books began to be studied. In his works, he was greatly assisted by Engels, who in 1844 made the acquaintance of Harvey, the editor of the Northern Star, for which paper he used to write occasional letters on German and continental affairs. In 1846 and in February 1847, the League sent 2 circulars to its members with the following questions for discussion. 1. What is communism, and what are communists aiming at? 2. What is socialism, and what do the socialists want? 3. By what means can communism be introduced in the quickest and surest way? Can it be introduced at once, or must there be a transition period in order to educate the masses for it? And if so, how long should that period last? Should it be introduced by force or by peaceful means? 4. What is the attitude of the proletariat towards the higher and lower middle classes? Is it advisable to cooperate with the lower and radical middle classes? 5. What is the attitude of the proletariat towards the various religious parties? 6. What is our attitude towards the various socialist and communist parties? Is it desirable and advisable to effect all unity of all socialists? 7. What is a proletarian? These questions were discussed in the Congress of the League in 1847, and in September, the first and only number of the Communistische Zeitschrift appeared in London with the memorable subheading, Proletarians of All Countries Unite. And in November 1847, they had a final Congress, which was attended by Marx and Engels, and also shown in the Young Marx movie that I mentioned before. And that at that time they were commissioned to write the Communist Manifesto, so that to most adequately reply to those questions. A comrade described Marx and Engels in those days. He said, Marx was still a young man, about 28 years old, but he greatly impressed us all. He is of medium height, broad-shouldered, powerful in build, and energetic in his deportment. His speech was brief, convincing, and compelling in his logic. Marx had nothing of the dreamer about him. Friedrich Engels, Marx's spiritual brother, was slim, agile, with fair hair and mustache. He was more like a smart young lieutenant of the guard than some kind of scholar. A communist organization had come together along new lines, and Marx was turned loose to finish writing his manifesto. He set to work in Brussels using a model of the tract Engels wrote for the League in 1847 that we discussed, with his usual painstaking precision and depth. His comrades in London became impatient. Revolution had broken out in Milan and Palermo, and comrades needed their new manifesto out on the streets. In January 1848, they sent Marx a deadline. If he didn't finish the manifesto by February 1st, further measures would be taken. Marx finished in early February 1848 and rushed the manuscript to London, but the League immediately adopted it as their manifesto. Many of the ideas in the Communist Manifesto were not new, but Marx had achieved a powerful synthesis of disparate ideas through his materialist conception of history. The manifesto opens with the dramatic words, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism," and ends by declaring, "Proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Workers of the world unite." The manifesto appeared in mid-February as the official program of that Communist League. A few days later, an uprising broke out in Paris, driving the French king from power. Within weeks, the revolution the communists had expected spread to Vienna and Berlin. Within months, governments had toppled an area that stretched across the very core of the continent. During this upheaval, Marx and Engels' manifesto was enthusiastically received. The small communist trend across Europe had now a high-caliber weapon to take into battle, and it was quickly translated into all the different languages. In the wake of the publishing of the document, nervous Belgian police arrested Marx, and his wife was arrested looking for him, and she was jailed on charges of homelessness. Sound familiar? They were expelled from Belgium, moved to Paris. Marx and Engels reorganized the Central Committee of the Communist League and founded the German Workers' Club, which soon had about 400 members. Everyone's eyes were turning to Germany, because Engels wrote, "Things are going very well indeed. Riots everywhere." In early April, Marx and Engels slipped across the border into Germany, which at the time was made up of these semi-independent states dominated by the Kingdom of Prussia. They smuggled with them 1,000 copies of the Communist Manifesto, which had just arrived from London. Marx and Engels set up their operations in Cologne, where the revolutionary movement was most advanced. The local Communist League had grown to like 8,000 members in just a few months, but it was dominated by this rightist line that limited the workers to wage demands and even supported calls for a constitutional monarchy. Marx founded his own revolutionary organization that soon replaced the fading Communist League. They set themselves a task of reaching the broad masses and leading them to make revolution. Engels later wrote, "We were no good at crying in the wilderness. We had studied the utopians too well for that." In June 1848, Marx and Engels were publishing a revolutionary daily, the New Rheinische Zeitung, the New Rhineland Times. It hounded the monarchies of Europe and roused the masses for a radical democratic revolution against feudalism and autocracy. The Zeitung received a circulation of about 5,000, which is one of the largest in Germany at the time. In Prussia, the revolution never succeeded in toppling the monarchy. The masses rose up in repeated waves in 1848 and 1849. Government offers of elections co-opted the bourgeois opposition, while the Prussian army advanced on revolutionary centers. While formerly bourgeois and proletarian forces stood side by side against the last vestiges of feudalism, they were eventually betrayed by the bourgeoisie, who allowed the workers to be destroyed. In September, a mass meeting elected Marx and Engels on a committee of public safety, named after the revolutionary organs of power, which had executed the French aristocrats during the revolution in France 50 years ago. This gave the excuse for the authorities. On September 25th, troops knocked down doors and arrested key leaders. The Zeitung and all allied political organizations were banned. A wanted poster was put out for Engels, and so he and several other Zeitung writers escaped across the border and laid low for a couple months. Marx had played a leading role, but had not been like a spokesman in public meetings. The authorities had no evidence to link him with the conspiracy. So while others had to leave, Marx stayed behind in Cologne and almost single-handedly restarted the Zeitung in defiance of military authorities. Marx was soon put on trial himself. A jury acquitted him after his sweeping political defense, while a powerful crowd in the courtroom threatened to free him by force. In December, Marx reached a new radical conclusion. The bourgeoisie had proven incapable of leading the revolution to overthrow feudalism and the monarchies. If the working class did not lead the movement forward, it would fail. At his trial, he stated in regards to others in the movement, quote, "The point of view of the minority is dogmatic instead of critical, idealist instead of materialistic." They regard not the real conditions, but a mere effort of will as the driving force of the revolution. Whereas we say to the workers, you will have to go through 15, 20, 50 years of civil wars and national struggles, not only to bring about a change in society, but also to bring about a change in yourselves, and prepare yourselves for the exercise of political power. You say the contrary. Either we seize power at once, or else we might as well just take to our beds. Whereas we are at pains to show the German workers in particular how rudimentary the development of the German proletariat is, you appeal to the patriotic feelings of the class prejudice of the German artisans, flattering them in the grossest way possible. And this is a more popular method, of course. Just as the word people has been given an aura of sanctity by the Democrats, so you have done the same for the word proletariat. Like the Democrats, you substitute the catchword of revolution for revolutionary development. On March 2nd, Prussian soldiers came to Marx's home armed with sabers. They demanded that Marx turn over one of his writers, saying that otherwise things would turn out badly. Marx answered that they would achieve absolutely nothing with me. The soldiers suddenly realized that Marx had a pistol sticking out of his pocket. They lost their cool and left. Engels later joked that the Prussian garrison had 8,000 armed men, while the fortress of the Zeitung was armed only with a few bayonets, some cartridges, and the red hats of its typesetters. By late spring of 1849, the Prussian military tightened its occupation of the Rhineland, and the people fought back. Engels actually snuck in the Rhineland and fought at the barricades in his nearby hometown of Elberfeld. I just love the idea of seeing the son of a major capitalist who had been fighting on paper for revolution for decades, standing on the barricades, actually fighting one. But on May 9th, Marx got orders from the police chief to leave the country within 24 hours. His legal documents had expired, making him an undocumented foreigner. Sound familiar? The police chief accused him of, quote, shamefully violating our hospitality, with his calls for, quote, contempt of the existing government and for its violent overthrow and for the establishment of a social republic. With all the editors facing exile or arrest, the Zeitung couldn't continue. Marx published a last issue on May 18th, printed completely and infamously in red ink. Marx's last words mocked the authority who masked their bloody suppression with fancy excuses. Quote, what use are your hypocritical phrases that strain after impossible subterfuges? We are ruthless too, and we ask for no consideration from you. When our turn comes, we will offer no excuses for our terror. 20,000 copies of this soon famous red issue were printed. For years, copies passed from hand to hand among revolutionary workers in Europe and North America, often together with the Communist Manifesto itself. As the counter-revolution of 1849 and 1850 advanced, Marx and Engels retreated south along the Rhine. Unable to stay any longer without papers, Marx went to Paris, where, under a false name, he plunged back into the struggle there. Engels stayed in Germany and joined the armed struggle against the advancing Prussian army. He fought in 4 battles before being driven across the border into Switzerland. In a letter to Jenny Marx, he claimed that, quote, the whistling of bullets is a quite trifling matter, and bragged that no one would be able to say that the communists hadn't stood their ground when the fighting got heavy. The May events marked the end of the period of revolution in Germany. Government repression went on for years. One revolutionary poet described how people would be startled in their homes by sudden gunfire of death squads executing revolutionaries. People found carrying the Communist Manifesto were arrested on the spot. A manifesto for a new world movement. Marx and Engels regrouped in England, where they were to work to re-establish a communist organization and planned a new revolutionary organ. Keep in mind, by this time, having achieved so much, Marx was just 31 years old, and Engels wasn't even yet 30. Marx had learned so much by the intense revolutionary practice of 1848 and 1849. The proletarian revolutions, he wrote, criticized themselves constantly, interrupt themselves continually in their own course, come back to the apparent accomplishment in order to begin it afresh, deride with unmerciful thoroughness the inadequacies, weakness, paltriness of their first attempts, seem to throw down their adversary only in order that he may draw new strength from the earth and rise again, more gigantic, before them, recoil ever and anon from the indefinite prodigiousness of their own aims, until a situation has been created which makes all turning back impossible, and the conditions themselves cry out, hic rodus, hic salta. Here's the rose, here dance. After 1848, communism was no longer a specter, but a real flesh and blood international movement, and the Communist Manifesto emerged as its most prized and influential document. Engels later wrote that the manifesto laid down the line of action for communists to fight, quote, as one common army under one and the same flag. Exactly because the manifesto embodied a materialist analyst and represented a living synthesis, different parts of the document seemed dated even when Marx and Engels looked back on them years later. And certainly we must remember that in the 150 years since 1848, the world's changed in dramatic ways, and there's been a wealth of new revolutionary experience to sum up, extending and deepening the understanding of communists in many qualitative ways. Yet still, with all of that, the core of this continuingly influential little manifesto, with its method of materialist dialectics, its visionary conclusions about the possibility of abolishing classes, its analysis of the historic mission of the new rising proletarian class, has maintained its freshness, power, and truth, and will continue to until it's no longer necessary. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels had pointedly said the communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. 3 years later, in the wake of 1848, Marx turned to his theme, summing up that communism, quote, is the declaration of the permanence of revolution, the class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transition point of the abolition of class distinctions generally, to the abolition of all the relations of production on which they rest, to the abolition of all the social relations that correspond to these relations of production, to the revolutionizing of all the ideas that result from these social relations. It took almost 20 years for a Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto, translated by Bakunin, to appear in Switzerland. It was smuggled across the borders into the Tsar's empire, sowing the seeds of a revolution in Russia. When the working class seized power for the first time in the brief Paris Commune of 1871, something that we'll also talk about on the podcast, the Communist Manifesto became the guide for a new revolutionary generation across Europe and North America. Many communists were now calling themselves Marxists. In the U.S., several versions of the manifesto were published in the 1870s, most famously by Albert Parsons, a leader of Chicago's revolutionary workers who figured prominently in the famous Haymarket events. In 1882, a new Russian edition appeared to train the generation of Marxists who prepared the groundwork for Lenin's Bolshevik Party. During the 20th century, the Communist Manifesto has been translated into basically every language on earth, and eagerly studied by millions seeking a new way to liberation. For 150 years, this Communist Manifesto has been smuggled and hunted, banned and cherished. It's a living example of how material reality can transform ideas, and how ideas are transformed by material reality. This work has literally shaped human history and influenced the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Its impact is a testimony to the power of the scientific ideology that guides the proletariat struggle to emancipate humanity. As we begin the 21st century, the closing words of the manifesto still stands out as a credo for those who hate oppression. The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by a forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling class tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. The arguments in the manifesto. So, with the background of what the manifesto produced, what does it say? Again, it might just be worth you going back and listening to the supplemental, but I'll give you the quick and dirty. In section 1 of the manifesto, entitled Bourgeois and Proletarians, Marx and Engels present a description of the development of industrial capitalism and some predictions for its future. They begin by declaring that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. In the modern historical epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, the class struggle has been simplified. There used to be a bunch of different classes. Now, really, there's only two great classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Since the Industrial Revolution, the bourgeoisie has captured political control. The executive of the modern, quote, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for the managing of the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Once in control, the bourgeoisie pitilessly put an end to all feudal and patriarchal relationships between employers and workers, and left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous caste payment. For exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie brought about the Industrial Revolution. It revolutionized the instruments of production by improving machinery and by destroying old industries and creating new ones. It created enormous cities, replacing existing relations of property with free competition, centralized the means of production, and created a world market for its products. While condemning the bourgeoisie for its brutal exploitation of labor, Marx and Engels praised it for showing that what man's activity can bring about. It's accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of a scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together, it says. Business cycles were another creation of the modern epoch. These recurring crises of overproduction put on trial, quote, each time more threateningly the existence of the entire bourgeois society. The bourgeoisie surmounted these crises by finding new markets to exploit and by increasing their exploitation of existing markets. However, their actions paved the way for, quote, more intensive and more destructive crises, and diminished the means by which crises are prevented. The epoch of the bourgeoisie also brought about the development of the proletariat, the modern industrial working class. Under modern capitalism, the workers were forced to, quote, sell themselves piecemeal to the bourgeoisie, and they, quote, live only so long as they find work, and find work only so long as their labor increases capital. They are consequently exposed to all vicissitudes of competition, to all fluctuations of the market. As a result of mechanization, the laborer had become a mere appendage of the machine. The increased use of machinery and the division of labor reduced the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, which enabled the bourgeoisie to replace the labor of adult males with that of women and children, like we discussed. Finally, modern industry has converted little workshops of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalists. Masses of laborers crowded in the factory are organized like soldiers, it says. Ironically, the condition of the proletariat deteriorated as capitalism progressed. The modern laborer, it says, becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. From its conception, the proletariat had struggled with the bourgeoisie. At first, the resistance took the form of isolated acts of machine breaking and arson. However, the advance of industry, in particular the concentration of the proletariat in large factories, led workers to form trade unions and friendly societies. Eventually, the proletarians formed their own political party, which compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. The manifesto goes on to say, as the condition of the working class continues to deteriorate, at some point it will become clear that the bourgeoisie is not fit to rule society, and then the veiled civil war raging within existing society breaks out into open revolution. The proletariat will overthrow the bourgeoisie and destroy private property. This process is inevitable. The development of modern industry cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all is its own gravediggers. The remaining three sections of the manifesto belong to the historian of political thought rather than the historian of economic analysis, and can be quickly summarized. Section 2 states that the aims of the communists may be summed up by a single sentence: abolition of private property. It concludes with a list of 10 reforms that the communists would undertake, including the expropriation of all land rent, institution of a heavy progressive tax, abolition of the right of inheritance, centralization of credit and transport in the hands of the state, free public education for all children. Section 3 is a critique of other forms of socialism, either reactionary, conservative, or bourgeois, or utopian. Finally, Section 4, which is only 2 pages long and apparently unfinished — remember, Marx was under pressure from the Communist League to finish the thing — states the position of the communists with regards to the existing opposition parties in Europe. The communists support revolutionary movements to overthrow forcibly existing social orders throughout Europe, but the manifesto concludes with its famous words: "The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite." All right, next time on the Sensible Socialist podcast, we're going to be talking about probably the most common criticism of socialism you'll hear, which is that it's never worked. Look at all the times it's tried and it's never worked. There's going to be something wrong with the idea, right? So next time we're going to take that criticism head on and see what we can figure out. So join me next week on the Sensible Socialist podcast.
So you say I'll make it to heaven, are you certain?